All right, so we're back and ready to really get into the thick of it with the Aceh War.
Picking up right where we left off last time.
Exactly. And, if you listen to that first part, you'll remember, the Dutch thought they had this whole thing. Well, they thought they had it wrapped up, right?
Yeah, 1903 rolls around.
1903, they've got this document, the Korte Verklaring, the
KV.
The KV. They're thinking, boom, victory, we're done here. But as anyone who's even glanced at Aceh history knows, things are never that simple, are they?
Not even close. It's like the Dutch celebrated too early. They looked at the map, saw their flag all over it, and thought, we've won. But they missed something pretty crucial.
Okay, so spill the tea. What did the Dutch miss?
They completely misunderstood Aceh society. They thought, oh, we'll get the Sultan, a few powerful chiefs to sign this paper, and everyone will just fall in line. Very European, very top-down thinking.
That classic conquer the king, conquer the kingdom mentality.
Exactly. But Aceh wasn't like that at all. It was, I guess, decentralized is the word.
More like a tapestry of allegiances, right? We talked about that in the first part. You had powerful religious figures, local strongmen, all these different groups with their own agendas.
And loyalties that could shift on a dime. So the Dutch, by focusing on this kind of formal surrender, they missed the bigger picture.
It's like, I remember that line from one of the sources, something like, the Dutch had conquered the map of Aceh, but not Aceh itself.
Right. They might have won a few battles, even forced some concessions, but the war, the real war, was far from over.
So the stage is set. The Dutch are patting themselves on the back. Meanwhile, the Aceh are like, hold on, we're just getting started.
It's this incredible moment of disconnect. And from that point on, things get even more, let's just say the resistance enters a whole new phase.
More decentralized, more, what's the word?
Guerrilla.
Guerrilla. Right, that's what I was thinking of.
More reliant on local knowledge, hit-and-run tactics, all that. And to lead this new phase, a really fascinating group rises to the forefront, the Ulama.
Okay, now I vaguely remember the Ulama from our, from the prep for this, but give us a little refresher. Who are these guys?
So in the simplest terms, they're the scholars, the experts in Islamic law and tradition. But in Aceh, they were way more than that. They were community leaders, judges, spiritual advisors. They had serious influence.
So when the Dutch, when they either co-opted or sidelined the traditional chiefs, it created this vacuum. And the Ulama, they stepped right into it.
Exactly. And it was a game changer for the resistance. Because suddenly, it wasn't just about land or politics anymore. It became a holy struggle, a fight against an infidel invader.
Okay, so that's where we get this concept of Perang Sabin.
Exactly. Holy war. It transformed the conflict, gave it a whole new layer of meaning, and frankly made it even harder for the Dutch to wrap their heads around.
And I'm guessing it also had a huge impact on, how the Aceh fought, right?
Oh, absolutely. This is where the whole idea of guerrilla warfare really takes root. We see it in the tactics, the leadership, everything. And speaking of leadership, there are some pretty incredible figures who emerge in this period. Guys like Tunku Ditiro.
Oh, yeah, he's been popping up all over the place in the sources we've been looking at, almost legendary status. Right?
For good reason. Ditiro, he's kind of like the Che George Washington. Charismatic, brilliant strategist, deeply religious. He manages to unite these different factions under the banner of Islam.
Okay, so not just a religious leader, but also a military mastermind.
Right, because he knew he couldn't win a head-to-head fight with the Dutch. So he focused on what he could control, the terrain, the people, the power of belief.
Guerrilla Warfare 101.
You got it. And it drove the Dutch absolutely crazy. Imagine you're this powerful army, you think you're in control, and then bam, you're ambushed in the jungle. You never know where the next attack is coming from.
A constant state of paranoia.
Wow.
Talk about a psychological blow.
Oh, it was. And to make things even more interesting, the Aceh, they weren't just fighting on the battlefield. They were fighting a war of ideas, a war of stories.
Now you've got me curious. What do you mean by that?
Remember those Hikayat Baram Sabil we talked about earlier? Those epic poems about the war?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
Think of them as propaganda, but way more artistic. They told tales of Aceh bravery, of martyrdom, of resisting the Dutch. They were meant to inspire, to rally the people.
So they're fighting a physical war, but also this cultural war, right? Fighting for hearts and minds, not just territory.
Exactly. It's actually brilliant when you think about it. They're up against this technologically superior enemy, so they had to get creative. They had to use every tool at their disposal, their culture, their faith, their storytelling tradition, all of it.
Okay, so we're seeing this incredibly resilient people, this adaptable resistance movement. But, we have to ask, what was the cost of all this? It couldn't have been sustainable forever, right?
Right. That's the million-dollar question, and it's where we need to start shifting our focus. Because remember, the Dutch went into Aceh with dollar signs in their eyes. They wanted pepper, resources, all that.
The classic colonial story.
Right. But the thing is, the war, even after their supposed victory, it became a financial black hole. It just kept sucking in resources. And slowly, some people in the Dutch government started to realize, hey, this isn't going according to plan.
Well, that's going to be a tough pill to swallow, especially when you're this big, powerful empire. So how did they react? Did they start to rethink their strategy?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. You were asking about the Dutch reaction. Well, picture this. They go into Aceh expecting a quick win, right? They've got the bigger guns, the more advanced tech, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, the classic colonial mindset. We're the European power. They'll crumble before us.
Exactly. But then they run smack into this wall of resistance. And not just any resistance. It's like the Aceh are playing a different game altogether. They're using the jungle, their local knowledge, hitting fast, and then vanishing.
And the Dutch, they're used to these big formal battles on open fields.
Totally. So it's a complete shock to the system. And the longer it drags on, the more it starts to dawn on some of them, uh-oh, maybe we made a miscalculation here.
A miscalculation is putting it mildly, right? I mean, we're talking about years of fighting, mounting casualties, a treasury that's hemorrhaging money.
You got it. And the sources, they don't shy away from the dissent this caused within the Dutch ranks. Military commanders are pulling their hair out. Politicians back home are starting to ask some tough questions. And there's this growing sense of unease, like, what have we gotten ourselves into?
So they're realizing this isn't some quick cash grab. This is a full-blown quagmire.
A quagmire that's costing them dearly.
Yeah.
And so some of them, at least, start to realize, okay, brute force isn't working. Maybe we need to try something else.
So what? They suddenly decide to become diplomats. Offer the Aceh a peace treaty.
Not quite that simple, but there is definitely a shift in thinking. You see this with Heutsz. He becomes governor of Aceh in 1898. And he represents this new, more pragmatic approach.
Pragmatic in what sense?
He realizes that you can't just conquer a place like Aceh through sheer military might. You have to understand the culture, the religion, the way power actually works in that society.
So trying to get inside their heads, figure out how to play the game on their terms, to some extent.
You got it. And this is where the KV, that short declaration we keep mentioning, comes in. It wasn't just about the Dutch asserting their dominance. It was also about, finding some kind of common ground, some way to coexist.
Okay, so it's like, we're still in charge, but we'll give you some wiggle room if you play nice.
Yeah, something like that. And for some Aceh leaders, it did seem like a viable option, a way to preserve some of their traditional authority, maybe protect their people from the worst of Dutch rule.
But I'm guessing not everyone was on board with this whole compromise thing.
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah. Especially the more religiously motivated factions, the guys who saw this as a holy struggle. For them, any deal with the Dutch was a betrayal.
And that's where figures like K.E.M come in, right?
Right.
He was one of the guys who just flat out rejected the KV.
Yeah, K.E.M, he's like the embodiment of that unwavering resistance. He saw any kind of accommodation with the Dutch as surrender.
A true hardliner.
And a brilliant military leader. He knew how to use the terrain to his advantage, constantly on the move, launching these surprise attacks, harassing the Dutch, just making their lives a living hell.
I bet that drove him crazy, this feeling that they could never fully control things.
Oh, it did. And his defiance, it had this ripple effect. It inspired others to keep fighting, to never give up.
And then there's K.E.M. Now, he's a bit of a different story, isn't he? We talked about him earlier as a kind of wild card.
Yeah, K.E.M, he's fascinating because he's not driven by ideology or religion like K.E.M. He's more of a pragmatist, a survivor, always looking out for number one.
So he was playing both sides.
Exactly. He'd collaborate with the Dutch when it suited him, maybe provide them with some intel, help them take down a rival. Then he'd turn around and support the resistance if he saw an advantage there.
Talk about slippery. I can't imagine the Dutch were too thrilled about having to deal with a guy like that.
Oh, they weren't. But it shows you how complex the resistance was. It wasn't this unified front. It was more like a kaleidoscope of different groups, different agendas, all constantly shifting.
So it's this war on multiple fronts, right? The Dutch are fighting the Aceh, but they're also fighting against their own misperceptions, their own assumptions about how this whole thing was supposed to play out.
And that's one of the key takeaways here. It's not just about military strength. It's about understanding the psychology of your opponent, the cultural factors, the things you can't always see on a map.
Right. Because maps don't show you the resilience of a people, their willingness to fight for their way of life, their homeland. And I think that leads to a really important question, one we haven't fully addressed yet. What was the true cost of this war? Not just for the Aceh, but for the Dutch themselves.
Well, we've touched on the financial cost, the drain on their resources. But it went deeper than that. We were talking about the cost of the war for the Dutch.
Yeah.
It was more than just money, though. That was a big part of it. Like, think about it. They went into Aceh expecting to get rich, right?
Yeah.
Control the trade, exploit the resources, the whole colonial playbook.
Yeah, but as we've seen, the Aceh weren't exactly keen on playing by those rules.
Or not even a little bit. And so the Dutch found themselves in this quagmire, this war that just wouldn't end. And it took a toll, a serious toll on their psyche, you could say.
So not just their wallets, but also their sense of themselves, their image as this powerful colonial force.
Exactly. Like, the sources are full of these hints of disillusionment, this growing awareness that maybe, just maybe, their whole approach to colonialism, this idea that they could just impose their will on another people, it was flawed.
Well, that's got to be a tough thing to come to terms with, right? Especially when you're raised on this narrative of Dutch exceptionalism, the civilizing mission and all that.
Yeah, and some of them never did come to terms with it. They doubled down, blamed the Aceh, said they were just being, stubborn or backwards. But others, you can see in their writings, in their speeches, this dawning realization that, hey, maybe we're not the good guys here.
It's almost like the war, the longer it went on, the more it forced them to look in the mirror, to confront some uncomfortable truths about themselves.
It's fascinating, right? And it's something that's still relevant today, this idea that military might doesn't equal moral righteousness.
Yeah.
Just because you have the bigger guns doesn't mean you're on the right side of history.
Well said. And I think that leads to another important question, one that's been on my mind throughout this whole deep dive. How did this war, this constant struggle, impact everyday life for the Aceh people? I mean, beyond the battles, the casualties, what was it like to live in Aceh during those years?
It's a question that's hard to answer fully, but the sources we've been looking at, they do give us some glimpses. Like, imagine living in a village, constantly on edge, never knowing when the next raid might come, whether from the Dutch or from, other Aceh factions.
Yeah, because it wasn't just the Dutch they had to worry about, right? The resistance itself was pretty fragmented, with all these different groups vying for power.
Exactly. It was this incredibly complex and dangerous landscape.
Yeah.
And for ordinary people, it meant living with this constant fear, this uncertainty. They might have to flee their homes, their farms might be destroyed, their families torn apart.
It's that whole idea that war, it's not just about the soldiers on the battlefield, it's about the ripple effects, the way it disrupts entire societies, entire ways of life.
Right. And for the Aceh, it meant this constant adaptation, this need to find ways to survive, to resist, to hold on to their identity in the face of all this chaos. You see it in the stories, the poems, the way they use their culture as a weapon, as a way to preserve their spirit.
And it's those stories, those personal accounts, that really bring this whole conflict to life, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about dates and battles. It's about the human cost, the individual experiences of those who live through it.
Absolutely. And one of the things that struck me most in the sources is the role of women. Like, they weren't just passive victims in all of this. They were active participants, supporting the fighters, gathering intel, even engaging in sabotage.
Yeah, there's that passage in one of the hikayats where this woman, she disguises herself as a peddler and sneaks into a Dutch camp to deliver a message.
Exactly. And it just shows you that resistance takes many forms. It's not always about picking up a weapon. It's about finding ways to disrupt the enemy, to undermine their authority, to keep the flame of hope alive.
And it's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit finds ways to persevere, to find strength, to resist oppression.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And, I think as we wrap up this deep dive, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what it all means, what lessons we can draw from this long and bloody chapter of history.
Yeah, because it's not just about the past, right? These are themes, these are issues that are still with us today in different forms and different contexts.
Absolutely. The Aceh War, it's a story about power and resistance, about the clash of cultures, about the human cost of colonialism, and those are things that, unfortunately, we're still grappling with all over the world.
Yeah, we see it in the fight for self-determination, in the struggle against oppression, in the way people are still resisting those who try to control them, to exploit them, to erase their identity.
And I think one of the most important things we can learn from the Aceh is the power of resilience, the importance of never giving up hope, even when the odds seem stacked against you. They showed us that even a small nation, a people with limited resources, can stand up to a powerful empire and make them pay dearly for every inch of ground.
It's inspiring, but it's also a cautionary tale, right? A reminder that the fight for freedom is often long and difficult, and that there will be setbacks, there will be losses along the way.
Of course. But the Aceh, they never lost sight of their goal. They never gave up their dream of a free Aceh. And that's a legacy that should resonate with all of us, no matter where we come from, no matter what struggles we face.
Well said. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. It's been an incredible journey exploring the depths of the Aceh War, uncovering those hidden stories, those voices that often get lost in the grand narratives of history. So to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. And remember, history is more than just dates and battles. It's about the choices people make, the struggles they endure, the dreams they fight for. And those stories, they have the power to teach us, to inspire us, to remind us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can find a way to shine through.